Welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Venturing out as an entrepreneur can be a daunting task, especially without appropriate guidance. Fortunately, we're joined by two of the most innovative entrepreneurs in the field of imaging informatics to learn about their journeys and advice for taking an idea from bench to bedside or serving as a consultant. Dr. Khan Siddiqui is a Chief Medical Officer and Chief Strategy Officer at Hyperfine, previously founder and CMO of Higi, and Director of Healthcare AI at Microsoft. He also serves as an advisory board member to a number of companies. Dr. Woojin Kim serves as Chief Medical Information Officer and advisory board member at Rad AI, and previously served as CMO and co-founder of Equim Intelligence and CMIO at Nuance Communications. He's also served as an advisory board member for a number of companies and serves as a member of the SIM Board of Directors. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this next episode of Simcast. Welcome back, everyone, to this episode of Simcast. We're here with some legends in the field of imaging informatics and people I personally look up to. So Woojin Kim and Khan Siddiqui and Mohammed, of course. Thank you for joining us. It's just a pleasure to have you here, and hopefully we can touch base on a wonderful conversation that actually started with the 2022 fall term NICRAD course, where we had a roundtable talking about entrepreneurship in imaging informatics. I think that there's just such rich stories and backgrounds here and inspiring details that can help guide those of us who may have a future in a similar field. So with that, why don't we start off with your paths in imaging informatics and how you got to where you are today? Maybe you can talk about why you pursued careers as entrepreneurs and consultants among the options that I'm sure that you had. So, Woojin, if it's okay, we can start with you and go from there.
Yeah, that would be great.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be on and to share my experiences. As far as, how I got into entrepreneurship and imaging informatics, I think it all started with, when I was a resident, I always looked at the kind of the workflow that I did as a resident and really disliked wasting time. And one of the things that I, did as a, first year resident was, dictating DEXA reports manually. And, I shared this story during the NIC course. And that whole process where, I thought, hey, this is a huge waste of time. Is there some way for me to, automate this so that I don't have to spend 2-3 hours every day, manually dictating DEX cases? And when I automated that process by teaching myself Visual Basic, Bill Boone, one of the co-residents, saw me doing this and said, if you like doing this kind of stuff, you should do informatics. And so he really got me into looking into imaging informatics fellowship, which I didn't even know existed at that time. And that allowed me to go to University of Maryland /VA at Baltimore. Met, Khan Siddiqui, Elia Siegel, Navio Safdar, and Paul Naji, and did my informatics fellowship during the same time that I did musculoskeletal fellowship. And that got me into imaging informatics. So I really owe it to, Khan, who's on the call right now, for not only the informatics training, but also my first company, actually, which was Yadalook, which is the search engine that I made specifically for radiologists. And that became my first startup. And then, a couple of years later, when I became an attending physician at Penn, I decided, hey, since I know how to make search engines, why don't I make a search engine for hospitals? Since, it took forever for me to be able to find cases when I was at University of Pennsylvania. So I made something called a Presto, which was a search engine for radiology information system. And again, Bill saw that and said, we should commercialize this. So we started a Montage Healthcare Solutions, which became my second company. And then long story short, we were acquired by Nuance in 2016. I became their CMIO. And then after about 3.5 years, I left Nuance to start my third startup, Equim Intelligence, in demand forecasting and capacity planning using machine learning. And then most recently, last month, we were acquired by Rad AI, where now I serve as their CMIO. So that's sort of my pathway in terms of entrepreneurship and imaging informatics. And as far as consultants, one of the things that, happened when I was a CMIO at Nuance was, I was able to meet a lot of different companies, both within the US and internationally. With those connections, as soon as I left Nuance, a lot of those companies, approached me asking me to advise them, given my experiences. And so that led to me advising, a good number of companies now. I've been advising a lot of startups as a result of that. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Khan.
Seems like all roads lead to Khan. Is that true? Not a Khan? What do you think? What's your origin story?
I mean, it's not just me. I will tell you. I mean, I'm sure there are several other folks out there that can give similar stories. So that statement is actually quite true. So I owe to Khan quite a bit for a lot of my success.
First of all, thanks for inviting me early here. And I think Woojin is giving me too much credit. If you go back and think about, I've tell you stories on how Woojin came about at University of Maryland and how he really captured all the informatics ideas and really was blowing us away. It doesn't make a difference where he would have been. He would have succeeded no matter what, right? So I just recognized very early on, like, hey, I need this person on the team. We have a lot of fun together. It's really hard to, when you are at the moment doing things, to really understand what is it that is motivating you or why you are doing certain things. It ends up being much easier in hindsight, in retrospect, to really think through, like, of all the things you've done in your career and all the things you're positioning. Does it have a common theme? Does it have a trigger point that kind of do? And if I do that, then for me, it becomes passion against problems that either I have that I'm passionate about, and because it's making my life miserable, or somebody I love is impacted by it. And then how do I create a social impact around that, right? So if I go back thinking about what are the problems, one of the first problems I wanted to solve, I was really in high school, was, my mom, both my parents were faculty and physicians. And one of the things in the summer we used to do is tabulate exam results by hand on sheets of paper. And I hated it. And this is back in Pakistan. So a med school class would not be like 50, 100 people. It would be like 500,000 people. And just imagine tabulating results for everybody on a piece of paper and calculating it just was ruining my summer vacation. That's how I kind of thought of it. So the first thing I ever built was not a game, was automating, results reporting. And I would basically get my sisters to do data entry, and voila, here's the results tabulated, and here you go. And next thing I knew, 4 universities were using it, and I'm still in high school as their primary way to digitize their exam MCQ banks, results reporting, and all of that stuff. So that was kind of my first forte of solving a problem. Second one for me was, once we moved from film to filmless, how do you create teaching files? In the film days, it was easy, right? Print out or copy a film again, put some notes on a piece of paper, and then file it in a library somewhere that people can go read it. Now, what do we do in the PACS? Early PACS days, PACS did not have any kind of way to do teaching files. So I tried to solve that problem. Didn't really work out, didn't really understand how to do it, didn't really understand how to build that stuff. The next problem was like, hey, more people need to understand technology to help decrease the communication difference between engineers and clinicians. And I thought there should be informatics training program, which didn't exist, and convincing Elliot Siegel and others to start, the first ever informatics training fellowship program was another problem, right? Created the University of Maryland informatics program and ended up being the first fellow through the program. I'm sure you've heard that story. I'm sure that's posted and printed multiple places, and how that got started. And, the search engine thing that Woojin talked about, I know the exact day that the search engine idea started was one of the radiologists came to me like, hey, and let me show you a case. And here's an amazing case of, Paget's disease. And I'm looking at it, I was like, that does not look like Paget's to me. And I was like, how do you know this is this? So he opens up a browser and he's on Google searching for something, and he's showing me a picture on a blog post from a kid somewhere that wrote about an image that his relative had, and completely wrong diagnosis. Like, you can't make your clinical decision based on some blog post. Why aren't you using some published literature to do this stuff? And we realized at that time that the journals were specifically restricting search engines from indexing the content, or they were behind paywall, right? You had to log in and you had to pay for subscription. So Google would not search, other than what was in PubMed, would not search the content of articles. And guess what? In radiology, abstracts don't have a description of images. Abstract just has a summary of the article. And if you look at any radiograph paper, things like that, all the content of describing what is in the images in an article are all behind a paywall. That's what started this whole idea of Yellow and search engine. Like, how do we get people to access all this digital content, which is now had been digitized, right? All the radiology journals by 2004, when we started this stuff, most journals were digitized. Since 1991, everybody digitized all this stuff. So that's so it's kind of a problem, and solving the problem around that. But the problem I was trying to solve is that how do I get access to images to clinicians faster? I mean, that led to convincing Terra Recon to start their server-side rendering application. And now it's called Intuition. It used to be called AQNet, right, in the early days. They were against it. They didn't want to launch it because it would have killed their workstation business. And convincing an entity to change their product strategy because we think it's the right future, they saw was they just kill their workstation business, was a pretty fascinating thing. And getting frustrated by not being able to move things faster and do it yourself. The trigger point for us to start a company was once we did the search engine, we actually did it on University of Maryland network, right? We built the whole infrastructure there, and we couldn't get permission to expose it outside the University of Maryland. So nobody outside of University of Maryland could see it. The first version of it we built, we used to call it Google Merc. I don't know if you remember that or not. And nobody could access it other than people inside the University of Maryland. So when, we said, but we didn't want everybody to use it. And that's where we had to figure out how to start a company to do this stuff. And not only that, but we had to rewrite the whole thing because all that work was done and on University of Maryland computers, on a property, and they own it. So we not only had to redo it, we had to completely start from scratch and completely use a different framework. So all that stuff in Maryland was built on C++ technology, and we moved everything to Python and went completely on the Linux route to hosting it so that there was no issue around IP and using, work that was the property of University of Maryland, and that became Yaralook, and that got folded into Montage, and you heard it. So if I go back and look at the problems I'm passionate about how do I get access to information to people who need it at the time when they need it. And other one is how do I identify a problem that somebody I love is passionate about and I can solve it. So the two things I've been passionate about is hypertension. Like, my dad had hypertension, my mom has, and it's been a family thing. And I really want to have been focusing on it since med school. If you think of that, with every time I picked a topic to work on or talk about or research on was hypertension. And the other one is access to imaging as close to decision making as possible. Access to information, right? The reason of search engine was get information to the clinician as they needed. Where I'm at Hyperfind is because I want to get these images to the clinician hand as fast as possible. Why did we do server-side rendering and zero footprint clients at Microsoft? Why did we work on compression technologies? All these were related to this. So how do I get this information as fast as possible to the clinician? So those are the two themes, if you think of it, the problems that I get excited about. So the business idea, the entrepreneurship idea is secondary, is a means to achieve the result rather than the actual result itself. The goal for me has always been solving the problem.
I want to thank you both for the detailed answer. And I love the fact that you gave such concrete examples of projects, problems, and things that inspired your start in entrepreneurship. Now, a lot of the things you've named were things that were successful. And one cannot help but wonder that, was it always successful for you? Were there failures? And when you went through failures, what did you learn as a common challenge that perhaps you came across? Any advice for listeners? Anything that you always remember as you tackle new problems to make sure that you avoid those mistakes? Khan, maybe we start with you this time and we go back to Woojin.
So I think one of the beauty of being an early entrepreneur is, you have the fear of unknown, right? So you do things because you don't know what it is. And then what it ends up happening is fear of known is what ends up being more important. So were there problems that I went after that never worked out? Yeah, there were. We tried to build a national provider index, but then realized the government is going to do it anyway. That wasn't a good idea. We tried to think through, solving a payment problem for healthcare side of things that never ended up being a product or a solution. So there were big problems like that tried to focus on that we couldn't figure out. A lot of the things, if I think of it that way, right? So probably like any company that you see, I've probably tried 5 different ways to solve the problem before I landed to a certain. People call it pivoting. In my mind, it's really, hey, that's not the right solution to the problem I'm trying to solve. Because, for me, I've never been married to an idea. Like, how did Higgy start, right? Higgy started with the idea that, there's so much information that consumer has, patient has, that physician have no knowledge of. And if you look at outcomes data, and as you go into value-based care, is more dependent on what a person does in the daily life than what you do in practice of medicine or even genetics, right? So 40 to 60% of your outcomes are dependent on what your social economic, your interaction, social determinants, and what you do in your daily life versus what you do, what medications you are on, or what your genetic profile is. And in 2009, 10, none of that information was coming into the enterprise. So how are doctors supposed to take risk on a population so that was supposed to be Higgy how we started, right? We started with data platform. Then the question became like, how do we engage the consumer? So we went and said, okay, maybe we make a video game that you have to go exercise, work out, gain points, then you can advance in it, right? So like, how do you marry this physical, things that make you healthy and live better life into a actual video game that you progress in digitally in environment? Well, realize that other people have tried that and didn't really work. So that was out the door. How do you engage them? Then we said, okay, fine. How about we build a wearable that tracks all these vitals, and that's the right way to do it. And as part of this whole journey, we came to conclusion that it really are 2 diseases, maybe 3, that cause most of the cost problem: hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. Right, and at the end of the day, it just becomes most important to know your continuous blood pressure levels on a daily basis, your glucose on a daily basis, or H1C on a daily basis, and your weight on a daily basis to really understand how you're doing. So it's literally those 3 vitals were the things that became important. And we ended up saying, okay, fine, do we have to solve everything, or can we just do hypertension? And that's when we ended up, actually what the intern on my team figured out, like, as you're thinking through struggling, like, how do we capture blood pressure, from consumers, do we buy cuffs for everybody? How do we do this? And he goes like, what about those kiosks? And my dismissive answer was, those things never work. It's already broken all the time. And he goes, exactly. Right. So, and then we all literally got out, walked to the nearest CVS and spent the whole day watching people use old school kiosks from the 80s and decided, okay, fine, that's the device we're going to go build to do this stuff. So all these, Mohan, you can call them failures, right? That happened over time till we figured out what the right what solution is. I mean, same thing, how we decided to, at Microsoft, you do machine learning on the GPU, because this was early days where we were just doing it. We were trying to do it on FPGAs, trying to do it on CPUs, till we figured out GPU is the right way to do it. And NVIDIA was like, you guys are crazy. This is not designed for this purposes, and convinced them that no, you have to do machine learning on GPUs. It'll have much more compute power, and the rest is history, right? So these are defining moments that happen where you're trying to make a small decision where you're not realizing the big impact it'll have long term. Woojin, thoughts?
Yeah, no, Khan gave a lot of great concrete examples. So I would, staying a little bit more general from my perspective, I've been extremely fortunate that all 3 of my startups exited. And given that, if you look, people say 9 out of 10 startups fail. But, if I were to start another one, which, people started asking me like, hey, when are you going to start the next one? I suspect it may be bigger. And I'll be honest with you, that does make me a bit nervous that I have not had a quote unquote a failure. And I have to say, I'm even more grateful as, if you've been paying attention last year and this year have been particularly difficult for many startups. But having said that, I will tell you, we deal with failures all the time internally. And we had to pivot several times, both big and small, in all of my startups. And like Khan said, you have to be flexible and not be married to an idea, and be humble enough to realize when you're wrong. And the good thing about having great teammates is that they will tell you when you're wrong. And that's one thing that I definitely recommend of having good teammates, because you don't want people just constantly telling you, oh yeah, that's a great idea, when you definitely want folks around you that will tell you, hey, buddy, I think you need to rethink this. And, you think it get easier with each startup, but I can share with you that each startup has its unique challenges. I can offer many pieces of advice, but I also learned that each piece of advice doesn't necessarily fit everyone the exact same way. So having said that, let me offer two pieces of advice when it comes to startups and success. First, I would say choose whom you work with very carefully. The people you work with can really make or break the company. So I think the folks around you, who you surround yourself with, who you work with, is very important from day one. And second, I would say you should really prepare your company and have all the paperwork organized, including all the finances, as if you're going through due diligence from day one. Because if you don't, and you are successful, and you do come to an potential acquisition, I would tell you, if you don't have that organized, you're gonna have a really, really rough time, and it may actually jeopardize the deal. As far as other quote unquote failures, I've had several angel investments that actually fail. And one common thread that I've noticed about those companies is that they have poor communication with their investors. Initially, they'll contact you a lot. And then, once they get the investment, then they go radio silent. And the next time I hear from them is, I'm sorry to tell you that we're closing shop. And so one thing I've noticed is that the ones that tend to do well are the ones that give you, regular updates. So I would say, when you are starting a company, you most likely will get some sort of investment from outside, whether it's through angel route or through institutional funding. I'm sure through institutional funding, they'll force you to communicate. But regardless, it's very important that you communicate with the investors. If you don't do that, I've noticed that those companies tend to do poorly. So that would be another piece of advice.
So Woojin, on that second note, how do you tell from the get-go, when a company comes up to you and asks you to join as a consultant, as a CMIO, or any position, how can you do the homework in a sense to know whether this is a company that does indeed communicate with their investors and will be true to what they're saying even after they've received the initial investment?
Yeah, so having gone through this myself now, I would say literally if I were to invest in a company from an investment perspective, I would actually ask them to send me all their communications that they sent out in the past. Because if they can't reproduce that, that tells me that they're very poor at that. And that'll be one of the red flags. That alone is not going to make me not invest in the company, but that is definitely a huge red flag for me from my personal experience. As far as, your question about, how do you evaluate startups or, when they come up to you, whether it's for investment purposes or from a consulting perspective, I look at obviously the idea, the business model, the team, funding, and the timing. So those are the things that I look at. And, I've stolen this particular set of ideas from Bill Gross. You can find his talk on YouTube on 5 key factors tied to startup success. And speaking of the idea and so forth, I want to know who's using it, and who's willing to pay for it and how much. And that's one of those things that I definitely look at. In fact, one of the initial advice I give to folks is, you kind of want to start a company when you have a minimum viable product. This advice doesn't fit everyone, but I noticed that if you start a company, then try to come up with a product that usually don't do too well. But ideally, you want to have a minimum viable product first. And I also like to say that, you really want to raise big money in terms of funding when you have a product that people are willing to pay for. And without that, chances are people are not going to really invest in you. So I kind of want to know, with that background, want to know, what your idea is and, who's willing to pay for it and how much. And that really leads to, how much funding they'll need. I got this advice from Com many, many years ago, and I think it still holds true, which is you usually need more money than you think. And that's always been true. It's just like, hey, you think you need $1 million? Chances are you're going to need a lot more than that, for example. So people tend to underestimate their funding needs. So I like to see that. And, timing is a little bit difficult to assess, but, you definitely want to see how this fits into the overall marketplace. And this particular question that I ask is specific to physicians who come to me asking for advice about starting companies. And I know this may sound hypocritical since I worked as an attending physician when I started Montage, but one of the questions I actually ask is, whether if they're going to work on this full time or not. And if they tell me this is a night and weekend project, then as an investor, I tend to shy away. And I usually advise them that, they should really think about, spending more time on the company, and then I also ask, taking it to the next step, then, are they willing to quit, altogether? And if they say no, then that's also sort of a red flag for me from an investor perspective. But, it really goes back to what Khan said earlier is I totally agree with him is that one of the, the strongest factors in startup success is, do you have a passion for this? Because startup, you go through roller coaster every single day. I mean, you might have a great morning at 9 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock, you might have one of the worst days of your life. And that cycle just repeats over and over again. And the only thing that will get you through all this roller cycle, a trip, is if you have strong passion for what you are working on. If your passion is money, unfortunately, I don't think that's enough. And that's why, if the first response, they give me is, yeah, I just want to make a lot of money and retire. And that's not the company that I want to advise nor would want to invest in. So, I definitely want to know why they're making it, why they're doing it. What's the reason behind it? Is it your personal pain that you're trying to solve that may solve other people's pain, which was sort of my, initial motivation for getting into this area? But like Khan said, I want to know what passion you have and how strong that passion is. And literally, I make my investment decision, for example, based on the people I meet. So I don't care as much on the idea. I just want to know why you're doing it. And if the why is good enough for me, then that's good enough for me in terms of, potentially investment or consulting.
I'm going to ask our listeners to pause there, rewind, and get some paper so they can take some diligent notes. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Woojin. I actually probably need to grab some paper myself here. Colin, what about you? Any specific questions that you ask in addition to what Woojin said, or maybe you're mentally going through a checklist when someone comes to you with a pitch and is asking for your time and or your financial investment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for me, I've done it now so many times that I have a playbook now, so it's kind of easier. I tend to investing nowadays to people I've worked with in the past and have worked with me and seen my execution style and, how to build it, because I understand how they're going to build the company. I understand how they're going to run it. I understand that aspect of it. So a lot of my effort nowadays is really focused on my former employees or people I've mentored in the past. If I go back, what are the important things, right? So at the end of the day, it's always people, process, culture. As Woojin said, the first employees that you hire or the founding team that you build defines how your rest of the company is going to be, even defines the culture you're going to build. Somebody told me a long time ago, gave me this advice that A players hire A players because they want to pass on all their hard work to somebody else. B players hire C players because they're afraid of losing their job, right? So if you don't hire that A players up front, you will not be able to build a good company and good culture, because that is what will define. And as Woojin said, right, it's so important to know people who can work with. He said work with, I always call that A player, right? I don't mind people who criticize me all the time, but, they're passionate about it. And the other thing important is the inner why, right? Why are you doing this? A lot of the entrepreneurs will come and say, oh, we want to sell this to X, Y, Z and that's the first thing comes out of their mouth. They're not thinking about the real why, right? Their why is, I want to make a buck by flipping this thing, whereas not really passionate about the problem they're trying to solve. So it is really, really, really important to understand what's the why. Like if you ask any so we have about 140 HappyFind employees, right? If you ask any why they're here, they'll give you a personal story on somebody that has some neurological problem that requires imaging. Every single one of 140 employees has that story. That's one common thing that we focus on as we're hiring people. Like, what is your inner why, and why do you want to come and work here? Like, not the what, not the how, just what's the why, right? It doesn't make a difference what your role is. That becomes very important, right? So building the right people and then the right processes. And the processes need to evolve, right? There's the early stage of a company, what I call the barbarian stage of a company, where you're rolling up your sleeve and getting done whatever needs to get done, and everybody's wearing multiple hats. So in that stage of the company, there needs to be one founder or a founding group that defines what happens, right? You can't get stuck in analysis paralysis and can't get stuck in decision by committee, but really somebody driving what is happening. And as you're doing it, you're also making sure you're building processes, though, that as you scale, you have a good way to do the stuff. Once you reach like 50, employee number 50 or something like that, that's when you start to build on processes. And now it's more about, communication and ability to drive the whole process and have a mechanism to get everybody aligned with what is happening, right? So you go from a single person defining stuff to now have a process and a team structure defining stuff. That becomes really important. And at the end of the day, the culture, right? What are the values of the company? What are you going to do? What are you not going to do? And how are people going to behave? That is so important upfront to define it and talk about it. And building that culture and framework on how you're going to operate becomes so important. So just from that point, if you think of it from the other question was like, as I'm thinking about investing in a company and how do I think about it, Woojin was spot on. I do not invest in people who are not taking their own risk, right? If you want to take a risk on with my money, then you need to take a risk yourself, right? You need to be fully committed to the stuff. And again, I don't focus on the idea. I focus on, is the problem big enough? Do enough people care about the problem this person's trying to solve? Is the founding team the right team that can get this thing done? And is the timing right? So if you look at historically the companies that have failed, timing has been the biggest factor. I always give example to people, right? Like if I started Higgy a few years before, ACA, Accountable Care Act came on, we wouldn't have gotten the success that we did, right? And a lot of telehealth companies that really took off in pandemic wouldn't have had the success that you would have seen earlier on. So a lot of the time, the timing is important. So again, who's the founding team? Are they passionate about the problem? Is the problem big enough? And is the timing right for this company to exist? Those are the kind of things I think about from that point of view. And one thing I would kind of, it's easy to build an MVP product when you're thinking about software-only solutions, because you could actually build some MVP to do it. It's really hard to do an MVP when you're trying to build a hardware or medical device, right? How do you build an MVP of an MRI scanner before raising money? It's just not possible, right? So you need to have a very strong thesis. You have to have a very good background understanding on what you're going to do, how you're going to do, and be able to convince investors that this is what you're trying to do, and here's why you will succeed and not everybody else has been successful, and what are those challenges and communication. So my communication style is slightly different, right? So I agree with you, Woojin, that companies that don't communicate don't work well. If I invest, then I'm a pest. I always tell investors, if you're asking my money, then you're asking for trouble, because I'm going to be on the phone calling you all the time. So I take it the other way around, right? I just make their life miserable by just constantly bugging them and asking them, how can I help and what can I do? And those people, companies I've invested in, they know that then I literally call them on a weekly, if not a monthly basis, on understanding what's going on and where they are and what the challenges are. So communication is so important. I've learned from Woojin also, right? If somebody's not communicating, there was one company that Woojin and I both invested that failed, and that was the problem there. And since then I've learned, and I just turned it upside down. Now if I put money in, then I'm calling you myself.
I like that. If I invest, I'm a pest. I might borrow that myself if I ever invest in the future. So thanks, Khan. Quick follow-up question here. So a lot of what we've talked about is doing that background work, maybe doing some, whether it's market research or product research, or like you said, going to CVS and actually observing the product and behaviors. By the way, I'd love to hear that story another time and how you all managed that, whether or not that was hovering around the machine or coming back at optimal times. But where do you start with that? Do you just start with consumer behaviors, or do you let the vendor or the startup come to you with what their research has been? What's your level of trust in terms of doing your own background work versus taking what they've provided to you? And this is for either Khan or Woojin. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can quickly start, and I think it's really easy to understand what the problem space they're trying to solve, and really understanding that problem, how big the problem is, right? In a financial term, you're trying to think through what the TAM is, right? So in my mind, it's really understanding, like, for example, the company that Woojin and Bill started, the latest one, right? The scheduling problem. Yeah, if I came to you saying like, hey, this is what I'm trying to solve, you know exactly what the problem is, right? Because you lived in that space and you understand how big it is, you understand what the complications are, and you really think through that whole problem, right? So, and you can talk to 10 people in your practice or your friends to see, do they also think it's a problem or not? A lot of times it starts with with that aspect of it, right? Do I see the problem myself in my daily life? And do I know people that will be potentially customers, and do they see the same problem that I see? And again, not the solution, but the problem, right? Hey, I'll give you an example. A company I've invested in is trying to revolutionize pregnancy care, right? So, and my sister is a gynecologist, OBGYN. So when they called me and pitched me, so I called her up. I was like, what happens when a patient with high risk pregnancy gets admitted? Do you know what is happening to the patient in real time? He's like, yeah, my midwife or nurse calls me, right? So the physician sitting at home doesn't know what the patient is doing in the hospital, and only finds out when a nurse looks at the paper printouts of, uterine contractions and fetal heartbeat, and call and tell them like, hey, maybe something's going on. And when I talk to 5 different gynecology OB folks, and they all give the same answer, yeah, it's a phone call from a nurse or a midwife in the hospital telling me what it is, and there is no way to do high risk pregnancy at home. It was very obvious that's where it needs to, the problem they're trying to solve is bring that high risk pregnancy care at home, right? And the other problem I learned, and that my problem understanding was that majority of these patients get discharged. They're observed for 24 hours to make sure, and nothing really happens, and most of them get discharged. So you're talking about healthcare cost here, a full day admission, maybe 2-day admission to do monitoring for something that may not be an issue. But because mom was concerned about it, you had to go figure it out. And with our, telehealth and going to home, it was so obvious that patient will start demanding, like, hey, why can't do this at home? And how much pain it is and how much cost it is just to manage that aspect of it. So you kind of think through those problems, talk to different people, and you figure out, okay, fine, yeah, this is a real problem. A lot of people care about it. The patients will care about it. The physician may not think it's a problem because they have a nurse calling them, but they don't realize how much cost it is to get that 1-day admission each time a patient has some kind of a concern on their pregnancy. So just give me a concrete example on how I think about a problem and talk to a problem around this. I do not invest in things that I don't know anything about, right? So I would never treat a patient if I, or look at an imaging study that I don't know anything about. That's why you do things that you know. And always, somebody long time ago gave me this investment advice, just general investment advice, that other than stock, bonds, and real estate stuff that you do, that if you want to do your third focus investment strategy, it has to be focused on what you know.
This is excellent. Thank you both. It's really a very interesting conversation. I'm losing myself in your answers already. I'll definitely have to re-listen once this episode releases. But for now, I will ask a slightly controversial, maybe provoking question. But for a lot of people, it seems that when a startup gets acquired, things slow down quite considerably. Call it stalling, call it, something else. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about why that might be, and if it's actually maybe even true, because maybe from your perspective, you're working on something on the inside, but you're unable to share it outside the company. So Woojin, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah, no, often, like you said, you do see small companies get bought up by big companies, and the product that got acquired experiences a slowdown, like you mentioned, which is a real disservice to the customers and a detriment to innovation that made the product initially attractive for acquisition in the first place. To answer your first question about, why, do I think, that happens? I think there are many different reasons for it, but, some of the things that are contributing to that are things like, once the company purchased that particular product, you kind of want to know what the original motivation and intent behind that acquisition was. If their acquisition intent was originally to literally buy off the company, the competition, and take them out of the market so that they can, quote unquote, kill the competition, which I know sometimes happens, then that product will definitely die. So that's one obvious reason why, such products may, die right after being acquired. But some of the other reasons are, sometimes larger companies move slower than obviously more agile, smaller companies. So the, speed of operations definitely, can have a factor. But also, a lot of times the founders leave. And, when the founders leave, the product also, could face a slowdown, especially if the founders did not establish a good transition prior to leaving, or if they leave really early. Having said that, what I can tell you is my personal experience has been fortunately quite the opposite. I have to give credit to Nuance after they acquired us. Instead of, trying to kill the product, what they did was they put a lot of resource, both personnel and financially, behind the product. So they, obviously they rebranded. That's the first thing they did. But after they renamed the Montage product to Empower, they, continue to pour effort into it. So I can tell you that, there are a good number of folks that actually bigger than our original team that are continuing to make advances on the product. And I do know this because I still, consult for them. That's one thing. And then also, speaking to the founders, not to credit ourselves, but both Bill and I, we had a bunch of items in our future pipeline. And, we had customers that love the product. So we wanted to make sure that we continue not only supporting the product, but continuous development after it was acquired. So as a result, both Bill and I actually stayed on longer than the original, what was, required, quote unquote, as part of the acquisition, as part of the retention. We actually stayed longer to make sure that we established a, solid transition before leaving. And I think that's, probably another reason why that the product continues to evolve over time. So I think you do see that often, but also I want to emphasize that there are exceptions as well.
Sure, absolutely. I think to answer your question, right? This is so I give a talk internally to my teams, or whenever I, even now that I invest, I get the founders together and walk them through, help them with the strategy a little bit on how they should work, right? Every company, or even every job, right? If you think of it, any job anybody takes, goes through the excitement and initial hype, excitement of starting something, to then realization of, oh my God, there's so much work to do and I'm inundated, I'm learning, and then slowly, proving out and getting the product out, and then you see success coming in. So there always this lull that happens. Anybody starting a new job, first of all, right? Always happens. So when you're coming in, that 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, you'll be regretting, like, why the hell am I here? My previous, the grass looks always greener to the side, but this one looks worse than what my previous was. So it's a normal thing, right? So there is no such as a bumpy road. It is the road, right? That is how a startup is. It's going to be not going to be smooth. It's going to be ups and downs, and just know that's how it's going to be. And as you're building your teams, the initial forming stage where there's a lot of excitement leads to a storming stage where there's conflict coming in, lack of participation happens for employees, there are high emotions through in. And then as you started to figure out your product market fit, and as you're trying to get acceleration, that's when normalization happens, and then you start performing, and rest is history, right? So if you set the mindset up front for your team, for yourself, for your employees, that this is the cycle we will go through, the next 6 months, year or so will be in this lull where we'll have to prove it out, right? And it kind of goes along with technology adoption curve. The reason this happens is we all think linearly, but that's not how product adoption happens, right? It goes through this parabolic shape, or if you want at a multi-stage product, it's an S shape that repeatedly goes. You have the early innovators, the early adapters, and then early majority, and then it takes off. But the problem is you're thinking linearly, but whereas it's going through a very slow phase, and it looks like you're just not performing, right? And you're doing really bad. And that creates all this anxiety, high emotions, and conflicts in the team because somebody else thinks they can figure it out how to grow linearly, whereas that's not the reality. So if you set up that tone and set up that upfront for your teams and for yourself, and clearly see that, then that's how you win. I always talk about the startups that, hey, your commercialization point of view, you need to focus to who the innovator is, define who your innovators are, define who your early adopters are. The key people who succeed do that really well because they know that these people are not buying because the price or some feature of the product. They're buying because the value the product brings in, the inner why. So if you set your why up the right way, if your employees have the right why set up, you look for your customers who are the same why as you are, because that's how they will. I can guarantee you all of early adopters of Woojin's products all had the same passion and reason behind it, and they didn't buy it because of a certain feature. People who bought early iPhones didn't buy it because it had a keyboard or didn't have a keyboard, it didn't have good battery life. They bought it because they want to think differently. That was Apple's why, right? They want to think differently, want to disrupt. And that's how you need to be really good at thinking about it. It does create this limiting TAM bias in which, there's such a small group. you'll never be able to generate the revenue around this stuff. But this group is going to help you open up the use cases, open up your market opportunity around that stuff. So it's really important to yourself and for your early teams to have them walk through and really have them understand that this is what the roadmap is going to be like. And these are the phases you go through. So when there is that time where there's resistance, lack of participation, conflict, competition, high emotions, you can come and look. 3 months ago, we talked about exactly this thing will happen, and it's happening right now. This is just part of our growth strategy, not something new, not something different. Let's go through it. And what do you need to do? You need to create normalizing matters. You need to encourage leadership during that process to take it to your norming stage of the company. So anyway, just some business ideas and thought process on how to do it. This is what I mean when a playbook, right? So once I've done this multiple times, people I invest now are those who've done this with me and understand this growth stage of a company and early stage of a company and what you need to do to make sure your execution works in those stages.
And I want to take this moment just to recognize how generous that both of you have been for many of us in the field who are interested in not making mistakes. And thank you so much for sharing your playbooks and your experience and just such invaluable advice, honestly. And it breaks my heart to say that we're almost done with the episode. So if I could ask you one more thing, and we can start with Woojin here. Last thoughts. This could be advice. Where's the field headed? What you'd keep an eye out for? Anything that you'd like.
Yeah, great. So first of all, again, thank you for having me on. This has been a lot of fun, especially talking with you guys. And it's always fun talking to Khan. So, Khan mentioned, and I did as well, this importance of why. And one tip I can give you is if you're still not convinced, there's a good book, or you could just watch a quick TED Talk from Simon Sinek on Start With Why. So if you haven't done that, definitely do that. And you'll understand why we emphasize, starting with why instead of what or how. So having said that, I believe that a startup is, one of the most fantastic forms of making the world a better place. And that includes healthcare. And that's why I do it. And I will say, like Khan said, yeah, it's a road with lots of bumps, lots of ups and downs, but it's also fun. That's why I continue to do it. And who knows where I'll go after this, but, it's been an extremely fun journey for me. So if, someone were to ask me, roll back time and, go back 15 plus years and would you do this again? And I would say, yeah, I'll go on this same road, again. So I highly recommend it for those folks who are, interested in it. And speaking of fun, there's a great deal of fun within imaging informatics now, especially with AI. It's a ton of fun. And so it's very exciting. And, hopefully one of these days we can have another separate conversation about where the field is going. But one of the things that's been extremely fun for me is playing with generative AI. I know that unless you've been living under a rock for the last several weeks, I'm sure you've heard of, ChatGPT and, all the hype around it. And granted, it's got its own weaknesses and whatnot, but I think that area is extremely exciting. And I think you're going to see a lot of startups around that area in the coming years. And that is another, reason why this whole field is extremely fun and exciting. So for me, personally, travel photography is one of my hobbies. And because of that, and, due to COVID, I got into AI art several years ago. And it's been just fun watching this area progress as a result. As far as some other, last minute advices, I would say, if you're interested in advisory, one of the things that I do tell folks is, look at the FAST agreement that you can Google. That gives you a pretty good sense of what a typical agreement should look like or can look like. And if you're really interested in startups, then one of the things that I recommend always is, go on YouTube and look up Startup School from Y Combinator. They always have recordings from past years, and it's a great place to get some, information. It's a great resource. And finally, I would say, for this year, since we got acquired by Red AI, now I'm their CMIO. So my goal for this year and for the coming years is to make Red AI a successful company. And Red AI is another startup. And, one of the things that I consider as my personal weakness is, even through 3 startups, I've never had any experience with institutional funding type of, scale. And Red AI does have that. So with the synergy between my previous startup, Echo Intelligence, and Red AI, there's a tremendous amount of synergy. And so I'm really excited to, take Red AI to the next level. So that would be my goal for the coming year. Khan?
So I'll do some recommendations. Obviously, I start with Why by Simon Sinek's #1 book. You have to read. Absolutely agree with Woojin. I will do 3 more. I would do Measure What Matters by John Durr. Really helps you understand how do you measure what you're building and how do you drive team execution the right way. Number 2 is 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. Helps you understand how to build a team. And number 3 is The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. Really helps you understand the importance of culture and how do you build the culture in a team. So any startup trying to do this stuff, those 4 books, absolutely important. Number second advice I would give is that the phone is your friend, right? Learn as much as you possibly can, right? My best example, when I was leaving Microsoft to join Higgy, I called Peter Newport, who was my boss at that time, former CEO of Drugstore.com, CEO of MSNBC, very senior. And he said, don't get into hardware. Don't do this kiosk thing. I hate this thing, right? And I would call him all the time for advice. And then I asked him to be on my board. And he goes like, Khan, I hate your business. Why do you want me on your board? I'll be all negative all the time. I was like, exactly. I want to know all the failures you think, reasons I would fail. And I want to prove you wrong, right? So, and that's how I think I just build respect with him also, because he was so negative on why this thing will fail. And I wanted to know that insight from him, why this would fail. And I would talk to him all the time and have him on the board all the time, and eventually proved him completely wrong. And everything that he said would not work. I made sure, figured out how to make it work, right? So you always call, right? And then my advice would be, if you haven't made 100 calls, you haven't tried hard enough. Other way of saying is, if you haven't heard 100 no's, doesn't make a difference. So you're trying to sell something, you're trying to raise money. If you haven't had 100 no's, have not tried hard enough. And so that's kind of my strategy. Like people, it's really hard to keep hearing no, 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 no. You think you're doing something wrong, but if you believe in the problem, if you believe in the why that you're going behind it and passion behind it, and you can always move around the idea of what it is, but you'll eventually get it. I mean, I have a lot of experience raising institutional funding. We raised over 250 million for Higgy. I raised the Series D round of 92 million at Hyperfine. Did another 126 million in PIPE round, and then we went public. So I've had a lot of experience doing institutional funding, and always early stage funding and late stage funding, and it is always hard. None of them have been easier, and it doesn't get easier after your first one, right? So those are my advices. Those 4 books, and call as many people, learn as much as you can. And if not, why you will succeed, why you will fail, right? It's really important to know those kind of things up front.
I'd like to add just one more thing to what Khan said, which is make connections. Like I said at the very beginning of my talk, I attribute a lot of my success to Khan and having met him. And I can name dozens and dozens of people since then that led to my, all the successes. So definitely make connections and be nice.
That used to be my selling strategy for Informatics College Maryland. Like the reason to come to University of Maryland is get networked, right? I mean, that's all we would do at OSNA and SIM conference, meet as many people as you can. Everybody needs to know who you are. That used to be our selling strategy.
And be nice. I feel like and be nice. That's the community, right? That's just information.
So I'll give that credit to Elliot, to be honest with you. So Elliot took a chance, took my call out of the random, right, to get that fellowship. Sorry, we're going maybe along here, but I think this is important to understand, right? And I asked one day to Elliot, like, he made a huge difference in my career. Like, how do I pay him back? And his comment was, pay it forward. If anybody calls, don't say you're not available. And I think Woojin, me, and all of us take that to heart, right? When random people on LinkedIn reach out to me, and I always talk to them.
Thank you both so much. This has really been a great episode. Highly appreciate your time, your thoughts. It's always fun talking to you. Maybe I'll add one more thing that I personally learned from experience as far as connections. I will say, I've always said this pretty much with the exact same wording. There's no shortage of super nice people around SIM. So for any of our listeners who haven't had the pleasure of being at SIM yet, make sure you attend the next one. You'll thank yourself afterwards. That being said, this has been SimCast for this episode. Thank you to our guests one more time.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.